Fabulous. How are you, sir? Isn't that great?
Yeah, your skin is kind of running.
You're right.
Skin fever.
All right, I'll call the meeting to order. Please have a seat. All rise, please, for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. So as you can see, Ron's gotten a little bit smaller, younger, and better looking. I'm going to take in the meeting tonight. Ron is unfortunately at home, recovering from a knee surgery. So we wish him well. I know he's watching right now, so feel better, Ron. And thank you all for coming. Public input. I've got some names and I have a letter to read. First, and I don't know what order this is, so excuse me if you were first on the list and you're not called first, but Ozzy Button, please rise or come up to the podium and state your address, and you have 3 minutes.
Basically, I'm here to strongly oppose on behalf of TNO Legacy for Vickery's agreement that was signed with the city. And I did not get the invite, and I'm the largest landowner right now that's going to get impacted. And I was not told about this agreement. This is the first time I'm hearing about this agreement. And Vickery has the largest number of units, even though I'm the largest landowner on this side right now. And he's been using it for the last 6 years. No one else has been using it. And he's got 225 units, and I've got only maybe maximum 40 units. And of course, I'm strongly opposing to that, to renewing that agreement. And I would like to discuss it further at a later point. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next, Ted Stranzik.
Handout. Focuses on our shape. My name is Ted Stranzik. I live at 1020 North Berry Trail Court, and I'd like to discuss or just overview the 2018 Fire Code Amendment. This was discussed earlier, and I'd like to kind of recap what's going on and my recommendation going forward. In the spring of 2021, Mayor Robinson appointed Rudy Castillo, Larry Johnson, and myself to review any suggested changes to the 2018 Fire Code Amendment. Working with Mike Lugo, Assistant Fire Chief, we reviewed this new amendment and discovered numerous sections that, as written, disclosed requirements that were not in the best interests of Copper Canyon families and residential development. After 2 meetings, we agreed that Mike would memorialize our concerns, identify problem sections, and suggest changes to the document. You have a copy of that document. Please recognize that I am not speaking for Rudy or Larry, but I hope that they will concur with what Mike presented in an email last July. I have prepared copies and you have them In my opinion, the town needs to formally approve the 2018 Fire Code Amendment with changes Mike recommended. This revision removes numerous requirements and modifications that now reflect the best interests for our families and for residential development. I therefore recommend that the changes highlighted in this attachment be reviewed by legal and then sent on to the council for review and approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Dave Siciliano.
I was going to specifically address the Vickery change in the impact fee pro rata. Or this impact fee, we're calling it pro rata, which they specifically say is not an impact fee, which effectively is. In any case, we diligently investigated what fees we would have to pay as a developer before we began the development process. We relied on what we were told, and we have writings from the town showing what our impact fees were. They're a little over $61,000. We were aware of that. Based on being told that, we moved forward and relied on that and went forward with our development. I'm not at all opposed to Vickery's trying to recoup fees they spent to bring the sewer into the town, but at some point we have to rely on what we're told the fees are when we start the development process, because we lock all our contracts in. We've already locked in our revenue stream. We're locked in our development contracts with the developer. So now to come back and say, oh, we're going to more than double those impact fees, not only isn't fair, but I think there's some municipal code and some other things that talked about the city having to disclose what all the fees are before someone is approved to move forward. So my hat's off to the Vickerys for what they did. We do not oppose them trying to recoup some costs. We're happy to live with what the former amount was. We have to oppose an increase in those fees after it's like changing the flight manual after the plane has left the runway. I mean, we're off the ground. We've locked in everything with contracts. So I just wanted to make that clear and be happy to answer any questions on it. Thank you.
Pam Brandenburger.
Thank y'all for serving our town. I'm sure it's a thankless job, but so I'm here to talk about the short-term rental proposed ordinance. And I just have 2 points that I'd like to address. And one is having to get a permit and then all the regulations that go with that. I understand that y'all are concerned about everyone's safety, but I think having the town making us get a permit would put unnecessary liability on the town. Where right now the liability is on me, my homeowner's insurance, which I have beefed up to include for rentals, and I go through Airbnb and they have insurance as well. So they're also liable. And my homeowner's insurance and Airbnb have regulations in place because they're the ones liable, and me, myself. And then the other point I'd like to make is limiting the amount of occupants and vehicles allowed on the property. I looked up what Flower Mound does, and I know they recently had these same discussions, and they decided not to pursue short-term rental guidelines. They said there's no need for it. It would be a case of government overreach, and there are too many issues that would come from such regulations and not enough benefit. A councilman said, who are we to say they can't live their lives the way they want to, so long as they operate under the existing ordinances and there are laws in place to handle these issues, which I know y'all have been concerned about, sex trafficking and sexual things going on and selling drugs out of these homes and everything. But wouldn't that be covered by the law? I mean, wouldn't we call the police on things like that? They're against the law. And Flower Mound's attorney said having a regulation like limiting the amount of people or cars allowed unless illegally parked could be problematic legally. He referred to a court case in Austin saying the Austin Court of Appeals has claimed the city's ordinance is unconstitutional because it prohibits peaceful assembling of persons by restricting the number of people who could gather at a house. As long as you do so peaceably, you have a constitutional right to assemble. So, and that's it. So thank y'all for letting me speak and
Thank you, Pam.
take it into consideration.
Misty Ventura.
Misty Ventura, 9406 Biscayne Boulevard, Dallas, Texas, 75218. Speaking on behalf of the Vickery family, specifically related to agenda item 7.1, the extension and renewal of the reimbursement agreement for the sewer. I'm happy to answer any questions, but the purpose of my comments was to clear up some confusion related to that agreement that I think was discussed at a prior meeting. And so I wanted to address my comments specifically to that. The Vickery family worked with Copper Canyon in 2013 to put the sewer agreement in place. The pro rata agreement and the town's corresponding pro rata ordinance is not uncommon. It's very similar to other agreements of that nature that other communities use. It is a tool to assure equity and make sure that the first developer in that funds all the costs gets an opportunity to recover those costs that are oversized or for the benefit of the others. What's proposed in the amendment to that agreement is an extension in the term and an opportunity to recover interest or carrying costs associated with the construction costs for that sewer agreement. There was a lot of discussion regarding equity and fairness, and I want to make sure that the record is clear that the Vickeries are not asking that they be exempt from fees. They're not asking that the toll tract or the church be exempt from fees. Instead, what they're asking is a recognition that the costs that they already paid are attributable to those developments. They're also not asking folks to pay for something they're not using. So when we think about the reimbursement that's being requested by the Vickeries, it's in recognition of fairness not only to the Vickeries, but fairness to others using the line. So by way of example, if we think about the sewer line as having a total capacity and a fraction, the denominator of which is the total capacity and the numerator of which is the capacity that's being reimbursed, if you never use the line, regardless of how much property you have, if you never use the line, you're never asked to pay anything. You're only asked to pay if you use the line, and you're only asked to pay a fraction. The fraction is the portion of the line you use. So the Vickeries have already paid for everything they're using, everything Toll's using, everything the church is using, and everything that's not being used. And they're merely asking the town to extend the agreement for two considerations: the term, to give them a longer opportunity to recover their cost, and the cost to take into consideration the carrying cost of the money they've spent that benefit others. If folks don't want to use the line, they don't have to, and they never pay anything. If folks do want to use the line, it's only fair that they give the Vickeries an opportunity to recover the costs, both the actual construction costs as well as the interest carry cost that's proposed in the amendment. And so I just want the community and this council, as they consider this amendment, to be clear that the Vickeries are not trying to ask for something that's unfair or be treated special. They're simply asking to be treated fairly, asking that the folks that use this sewer line pay their proportionate or allocable share of those sewer costs. I'm happy to answer any questions associated with the amendment, as well as the pro rata charges and the timing and the costs associated with that. But I just wanted to be clear on the record that the specific request for agenda item 7.1 is to extend or amend the agreement related to the term and related to an interest carry associated with the unreimbursed oversizing costs. And with that, I will stop talking, and to the extent you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now or when that specific item is considered on the agenda.
Thank you, Misty. We may have some questions when we get there and we'll ask you.
Yes, sir. Thank
That's fine.
you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I don't have anybody else that had listed. I do have a letter to read for public input. So I'm going to read some correspondence provided to the town council and asked to be read into the record for public input from George Buller. With regard to the Vickery request to revise a pro rata agreement, I would suggest the following. I'm quoting from his letter. 1, the term of the extension should be limited to 10 years, not the 20 years requested. 10 years is sufficient to accomplish the development of the north side of the town center. The shorter extension period will encourage quicker development of the property. It keeps the pressure on the landowners. 2, the town should not agree to pay interest on the Vickery expenditures. That is their investment in their property. Their return should come when their property is sold. It is not the obligation of Copper Canyon to guarantee them a return on their investment. Therefore, to give them interest amounts to Copper Canyon issuing debt, which can only be done under very specific circumstances. Paragraph 9F of the original town center wastewater agreement specifically states that no interest will be paid on the reimbursement amount. 3, what consideration does Copper Canyon get for agreeing to the extension? We will get our fees when the land is developed regardless of whether we sign the requested amendment. 4th and last, before the town makes a decision on this request, I believe the committee should be formed to study the matter further. The committee should include residents who are not on council or P&Z. For example, how will this agreement interact with the sewer line being installed by the developer of the Williams Ranch? Should our small town be managing or maintaining these lines? How will our town be compensated for the additional work? Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, George Buller, 916 Hillside Drive. With that, I will close public input and move to executive session. The executive session that was listed on the agenda was intended to be a sheriff's office topic. There will be no executive session tonight. The sheriff's office has asked us to place that on the September 12th agenda. So that'll happen in a future meeting. I'm sure you're disappointed, Bob.
Crestfallen.
And there's no consideration of the executive session either. Staff reports. Donna? Council reports. You want to talk about the DRC discussion we had, Chase? Just super briefly.
Yeah, so we had a DRC meeting with Yanni Property, and it was advised for them to review their current proposed development to add quite a few more 2-acre plus size lots, especially on the perimeter of their property to protect the citizens of Copper Canyon and the visual aspect of it. There was some consideration given to the lots toward the back in Lantana where they could be possibly down zoned smaller, but all in all, I thought it went pretty well, and they're going to come back with hopefully a few changes to that development. So
I thought it was a good discussion. I was there too, and I think they're going to come back with an agreement that's going to increase the average sizes substantially. I think it'll be acceptable to everybody in the surrounding area and the developer. So hopefully that's what happens. Thanks. Anybody else? Okay. Consent agenda. We have several items on the consent agenda to approve. I was not here, so I have to recuse myself from that. If there is a need for a vote on that, I doubt there will be. Does anybody want to submit a motion to accept the consent agenda as written?
I'll make a motion that we review and approve the consent agenda for items 1 through 4 on the consent block.
So I have a motion by Councilmember Castillo. Do I have a second?
One second.
I have a second by Councilmember Liebert. All in favor?
Aye.
Any objections? No. Unanimous. Action item 1. Is Melissa here? You're the proxy for Melissa. Yeah, you asked for a few moments to make a presentation. I think that's sensible. Was that presentation that you intended different or the same as what you? The same. So you don't need to come up to the stand again to provide additional context, unless there's questions. Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you very much. On this particular item, there is a request for 3 asks. There's a term extension, there's an amount for certification, and there's an interest rate that is to be appropriated for the amounts. My suggestion is that we break it up into 3 components for discussion, if there is to be any, to give you some guidance. Because 1, I haven't seen the number in the second request before, so I don't know if that dollar figure is something that we agree with or support or have questions about in more detail. I think that requires some additional looking, some additional interaction. Yes. Yep.
So the concern is that the costs are not accurately reflected? Is that the concern?
Well, the concern is that hasn't been audited by the town. So there's a presentation of numbers, but at the end of the day, I think that requires additional homework from the town to make sure that we are in agreement with those numbers.
Okay,
The second thing is an interest rate conversation, which we can discuss. And the first one was the term.
understood.
So I think what we should do is break it up into 3 pieces, have a discussion. The long story short is I don't think it's going to pass as it is stated, because the second piece of this, which is an audit financials, we have an audit. We have no idea what those numbers are. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just suggesting that we haven't had a perspective on looking at these before. So that's my recommendation. Any objections to that partitioning of the discussion? So on the first topic of the extension with regard to a 20-year, I'll open it up for discussion.
Steve, I don't know what the magic is to a 20-year term. I am uncomfortable having a sitting council commit to that length of an extension. And the fact that that may have been done in other towns, it doesn't matter to me. Remember, if we agree to a 20-year extension now, we're binding 10 councils down the road to that. And I think it's something, we need to look at what we're comfortable from a timeline wise.
So looking at this, it was completely new to me. I had to wrap my head around it. And so before I even get to the term, I'm trying to understand exactly what we've got here in front of us.
Sure.
So a few questions, keep it brief. You say this is very similar to many other towns' agreements. So how does, and we're talking about infrastructure, how does this compare to, on a high level, to a water line that a developer has to put in, or a street? And why are those not treated the same as this?
Okay, they can be, and I'm going to speak, and then I'm going to let Bob Hager correct me if I mischaracterize this information. It is common for a developer to pay for development serving infrastructure and not get reimbursed at all. It is equally common when they're working with a community to serve an area and there are efficiencies to do, say, one line, whether it's a sewer line or a water line, And that infrastructure, regardless of the type, water, sewer, roads, or drainage, has to be oversized to accommodate others within a basin or within a service area. So you see these types of agreements, not when a development is paying only for what's required to serve that new development, but instead when there's an oversizing component. And when this particular agreement was entered into in 2013, there was a study done that said, let's focus on serving an area, the town center, and let's estimate based on the projected development in the town center what the capacity of the line was. So the study identified a service area, identified a capacity, and the Vickeries stepped up because they're community minded and said, okay, we will fund the one line that serves us and the rest of the town center. And we'll enter into an agreement that says the folks that use the line, not the portion that we're paying for us, we're never going to get reimbursed for that. We're only asking to be reimbursed for the oversized portion, the portion that other folks are using.
What was the actual cost? Because you've got the oversized portion based off of percentage of usage.
Mm-hmm.
What about the actual infrastructure cost from a 6-inch line, which may have been only what they required to an 8-inch?
So
Or whatever it may have been, the oversized portion, not based off of usage.
So the business deal that was done in the time was based on usage. It could have been done by an incremental increase in pipe size, but at the time in 2013, it was forward looking because there was no town center development and would never be town center development if there was no ability to turn on the taps and flush the toilets. And so in those instances where you're not accommodating a vertical development that's coming out of the ground at the time the infrastructure is being developed, it's often done on capacity, not on line size. And you may ask the question, well, if we didn't have an existing development that was ready to go vertical, if there was nothing shovel ready, why were we doing it to begin with? And the answer to that question, I believe, was spoken to by former Mayor Sue and others. And it was a function of the town's then current policy that they wanted to encourage the town center development. And there was an opportunity working with Flower Mound and others to get sewer capacity to this area that would have been foreclosed, but for this community's willingness to work with the Vickeries and the Vickeries' willingness to fund the infrastructure that put this line in the ground.
I guess the last question would be, was this just the agreement between the Vickeries and the town, or did all the parties that got the future benefit of this line potentially have a, agreement on these percentages, et cetera?
The only parties to the agreement were Vickery and the town, but the town's engineer at the time did a study and analysis based on ownership and projected development of what they thought each person's costs were. And I'm sure the Vickeries would have loved for other people to step up and bring their purse to the party and contribute to the cost, but those weren't the facts at the time. The only person willing at the time to fund the infrastructure was the Vickeries, and the consideration for that willingness was an agreement that allowed them to recover not all their costs, but their oversized costs.
Yeah, so these zeros here, when you first looked at it, you're like, oh, wait, they're not going to have to pay for anything. But you're just saying that they've already paid those costs, so that's why they're zeroed out.
Yes, yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm saying. And have you seen this that has all the numbers that was in the city sewer study? That was the genesis of the sizing of the lines. And this sheet that can be passed around and left with Donna and shared with everyone is out of the sewer study that was done contemporaneous with the line construction.
All right, I'll jump in here. Steve, if I could, I know that we're trying to divide it up to make it easier to vote on each specific item, but I had some overall general questions to clarify. And the first person I'm going to put on the spot here is Mr. Hager. You just moved. You moved. My question to you is, because I'm not a legal-minded individual. When I first read this, and I had no idea this document existed with the town before this has come up. After reading it, the only thought that I came away with is that in the original agreement, the town of Copper Canyon became the enforcement arm of an agreement made between a private party, the Vickery Group or whatever that was, and individuals who are landowners in the town center area that had no say in the discussion. They were not party to this agreement, yet we are forced, if you will, to force individuals who later developed to pay something they had no say in. And I'm curious as to how that's legal, that we can do that.
Well, the ordinance makes it legal because they're gonna access the line. I believe Ms. Ventura told you earlier, if you never access the line, then you never pay the fee. So what you're doing is paying your proportionate share. Let's assume that all the property owners develop the property at the same time. Every one of those property owners have the obligation to put in the sewer to serve their property. Economic considerations are it's cheaper to put a line in now than putting 3 lines in from 3 property owners. So what we'll do is we'll upsize that line. And the city, in their discretion, passed the pro rata agreement so that the person who fronts the cost has an opportunity to recapture me putting in my sewer or a sewer that you get the benefit of. So it's only in the event that they access the line that they'll have the obligation to pay for the line or to pay for that capacity. A lot of times it's done upsize based on pipe size. Sometimes it's done on capacity. I've seen both. So what I'm doing is I'm putting in infrastructure that you will benefit from. It's only fair that you pay your share of whatever that value is for benefit to you. And that's what the pro rata ordinance does. And it's the ordinance that's the enforcement against the subsequent property owners that purchase the land.
So
Or develop
the ordinance you're referring to is the pro rata agreement.
it. That's pro rata ordinance. There's an ordinance as well as an agreement.
Oh, okay, so it's,
The agreement is our obligation to quote, collect that and reimburse them from the collection. We collect that pro rata.
Right,
fund
and then we
from that
pass it on.
property and then pass it on. If that right never comes to fruition and I don't owe the money because I don't access the infrastructure, then I don't owe the city money and the city correspondingly doesn't own, in this case, the Vickeries.
so since there's an ordinance and an agreement, the agreement's about to sunset, the original agreement. Just so I understand what occurs, should the agreement lapse because there's no further agreement, what happens relative to the ordinance that applies to this?
The ordinance would exist and then we would capture that pro rata fee for the city or the town.
All right, thank you.
And if we extend the agreement, Bob, just to be clear, what happens to Mr. Siciliano's interest? Does
I
he-
believe that his fee is already set because his development's already begun. So I would have, how can I say, a vested right issue with the fee that I would impose against him other than what the fee is at the time he started the process of development.
Mr. Hager, just as a point of information, I bet if we both review chapter 245 of the local government code, the vesting statute, fees are exempt from vesting.
That's why I asked. I'm not an attorney though.
No, if they are exempt, and they very well may be, but that's an issue that we'd have to resolve.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that would require some discussion.
Misty's a good lawyer, so
Yeah.
I disagree with her on occasion. I don't know that I will on this one, but that's something I haven't looked at, haven't been asked to look at.
Thank you. Rudy,
I just,
back to you.
Ma'am, I just wanted to clarify something because you indicated that the vicaries and the church and toll were not in fact exempt, correct? On a share of it, is that how I?
Yes, I think there's some confusion because there was offered some amendments to the town's pro rata ordinance that's codified at Article 13.04 that expressly called out that they were exempt. But I think that's a misnomer. They don't have to pay. And the reason they don't have to pay is because they've already paid. And I think that's led to some confusion. And I wanted to clear that up for the record.
Well, thank you, because there's a lot of documents here, but one of the whereas indicates, and it actually says that no pro rata fee will be collected in connection with the development or use of the owner's 16.6 town center property shown on Exhibit C, the Bridgeway Church, and it gives the acreage, or Toll Brothers 88-acre property. And just as a layman reading that, it makes me think they've exempted themselves and these other entities from paying.
And I could understand how you would read it that way. The foundation that's missing, and perhaps we need to add a recital for clarity so that there's no confusion in the future. The vicaries paid for all of the sewer. And the vicaries are only asking to be reimbursed for the portion of the sewer that other people are using. The portion that the vicaries paid for benefited the vicary property, which included the toll property and included the church. So the vicaries are not seeking reimbursement for the allocable share of the capacity that benefits their property, the toll property, or the church property. And they're only seeking reimbursement from others if in fact others use the unused capacity. So if we, again, think about the capacity as a fraction, the denominator is the total fraction, the numerator is the fraction that other people pay for. Vicaries paid for all of it. And now they're seeking reimbursement for a part, the part they're not using. And the part they are using includes their property, the toll property, and the church. So if the words on the paper don't tell the right story, we need to change the words on the paper.
I think that's a good point.
Mhm.
I was sitting up here in 2013. And if my memory serves correctly, it was a take it or leave it from Firemount. When we had a capacity of 400,000 gallons, and that was it. And we either took it or we didn't have development at all on that 407. So it was much more binary at the time than I think anybody can appreciate today. Meaning if we didn't take it, we weren't going to get it. And if we didn't have sewer there was going to be no town center. So 10 years ago, right, we would have been cut off from any development, any retail or anything of that sort along 407. That was the position, if my memory.
Your memory is correct. Yes, sir.
So in putting the vicaries in a position where they have to take that capacity and apply it to the first development, I mean, I think what you're saying is correct in the sense that they were going to pay upfront for a line that was going to be large enough to serve the needs of PD1 and PD2, which was the town center south and town center north.
Mm-hmm.
And that anything that was going to be used north, not on their property, those developers would pay for, or those entities would pay for that used portion of line. That's the lay person's description of what I think you just said.
Yes, sir. And that's a fair summary. I agree.
So that's a little bit of context behind this. And it is a little complicated. And I don't think, based on what I'm seeing, that the vicaries want somebody to pay for what, they haven't already paid for, right? But I do think that there are things in here like the number of dollars associated with a certification that I haven't seen before. So we need to go through that, I think, with some, and we're not going to have time to drain it right now, to be honest.
And that's fair. What I would appreciate from the council, though, is some clear direction on how we confirm that number, because we've got payment certificates and data that supports the number that we're happy to share. So I'm looking for a homework assignment. I'm looking for clear instructions on what I need to do to get you comfortable that the number is accurate.
So I think, again, if the council decides tonight that there will be no extension of this, then it's kind of a moot point, right?
That's fair.
But if there's a conversation around the term and we think that there is a term, whether it's 1 day or 20 years or whatever, then it makes some sense to go through that process. If we go through that process, my suggestion would be that we take time between this and the next meeting to go over with the town administrator and others to make sure those numbers are copacetic. And that's the process that we would follow. It would be that simple. In terms of the interest, we can discuss that as well. I think that would be additional guidance on any follow-up conversations. So, like I said, there are 3 components of the ask. I think we can discuss them individually, 2 at a time. I mean, I think we're all smart enough up here to handle the nuances of how we discuss them. But I think just to put a stake in the ground on the second ask, if I may be so bold, we're going to table that because there's no way for anybody up here to know that those numbers are right or wrong. Not that they're being challenged. It's that we want some substantiation. I don't think we should drain this in this discussion. I think a responsible approach would be to look at it with the time needed between this and the next meeting. But on the first ask, which is the extension, and the second or the third ask rather of the 5% interest rate, I think we should discuss that and give some guidance back. Fair?
Yes, sir, it is fair. I would like to offer with respect to the term after the document that was presented to you requested a 20-year extension. The Vickery family participated in the last community meeting and heard loud and clear that this council is not comfortable with a 20-year term. The Vickery family respects that position and is willing to support what was discussed at the last meeting, which is a 5-year term with 5-year renewals. If the alternative proposed in the public comments of a 10-year term is something the council supports, I'm sure the Vickery family would support that as well. So what I want this council to understand as they undertake the discussion and provide the direction is that the Vickerys aren't rigid. They just want to be treated fairly.
Right. And so, Misty, it might be helpful in lay terms to just explain if the agreement was extended for 5 years, so that everyone here can understand and everybody out there can understand. What does that mean in terms of money flowing to Vickery's or money coming out of the pocket of anybody else? Can you explain that in very simple terms, like we were in an elevator going to the 70th floor?
Yes. So
Okay.
first, let's explain the term and how it's measured. The current agreement has a term, and the current agreement term expires based on the construction completion date of the improvements. So the certificate of completion for those improvements says they were completed and accepted May 9th of 2016. So if we extended the term 10 years, it would be from the current expiration of May 9th, 2026 to May 9th, 2036.
Okay.
So that's the first point. And the second point is the money point. What money did the Vickerys get during that term? They may get no money. They only get money if others, not them, use the line. And at the point that someone else would tap in the line, the town's professional staff that's reviewing the plat would do a sewer capacity analysis based on the proposed development. And they would take the total capacity in the line as the denominator and the capacity that the new development is using as the numerator and apply that fraction to the cost that's confirmed. And that would be the amount of money the Vickerys would be reimbursed. Does that make sense, or did I make that too complicated?
I think that makes sense. Everybody agree?
I have real mixed emotions about this. My first thought is the town has lived up to its obligations all the way through. The Vickerys, as I understand this, did this project because their property over there and the property on the north side would be shut out from Flower Mound if Flower Mound didn't permit them to bring the line forward from point in Flower Mound to their curb in the Vickery project. Is that right?
Almost.
Almost, okay.
There's
Correct me
a,
where I'm short.
yes, sir. Flower Mound would not deal with the Vickeries.
I understand that, but I
Flat-
didn't get to that point. Excuse me for interrupting you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, that's true. What I'm saying is the Vickeries made the decision because they wanted to bring the sewer from Flower Mound to their property to elevate the value of their property. Their property was worth so much money, and the code says at time, you know, you can do a 2-acre house there with a septic tank, and that would be the value of your kind of your base to go from. So you take and add a sewer line on top of that. Now we take the chance of raising the value of our property and also maybe the value of across the street, some other property we have and others that we have. Is that true?
Almost.
Almost
So,
again. I'm
so-
getting close.
yes, sir. So these are the two facts that I understand historically. When the sewer agreement was done, the property was already zoned town center. So the community had made the decision that it wasn't going to be 2-acre lots because 2-acre lots along 407 wasn't appropriate. So it was already zoned town center. 100% agree with you. If they couldn't make the toilets flush, the property was worth less money. Where you and I think, differ is what the Vickeries would have paid for left to their own devices. Left to their own devices, I believe they would have paid for a fraction of the sewer, the fraction that benefited only them and made only their toilets flush.
I understand. So you're saying is the Vickery step forward and come up with a plan to install the sewer line from Flower Mound to their property. So that gave the town center then can extend on from there anywhere it wants to go across the road into the other area. Is that correct?
Collaborating with Copper Canyon, yes, sir. They couldn't
So
have done
they
it
did not
alone.
extend it all the way to 407. They went to their curb on the south side in their property line. Is that right?
Probably, but since I'm not the engineer, I
Okay.
can't speak
Well, that's
specifically.
just for my sake. Let's just say that's true.
Yes, sir.
So then, okay, now we got it there. That cost so many dollars. That's the value to that point.
Mhm.
And this is our money that we spent to make it happen from point A to point B. Now we're going to develop all the land on that south side through some developer in the future. They didn't know who. Toll Brothers happened to be the one. So Toll Brothers then come in. Did they develop from point A to B, did they develop that project with up to 407 with their money, or was that Vickery's money there also?
A combination, right?
No,
Because
okay, no, it's a combination. Excuse me for interrupting you again.
Mhm.
So combination is that Vickery's had some skin in the game, money. Toll Brothers got a deal. You put in this subdivision, you can get these lots at a certain size. You can get this many lots. So it's equate out dollar, and this is how much money it's going to cost you to finish up putting it over to there. Is that about right? I'm trying to make it in plain English where somebody that doesn't know anything about anything can understand what we're talking about. Does that make sense?
yes, sir.
Okay. Now, if I get wrong, please correct me. I'm easy
Okay.
to get corrected.
Me too.
So therefore, Toll Brothers took the money and Vickery's had to put up more money. Well, when you said they
No,
brought it to
no.
point A,
So-
they put money in there, or did they just give an allowance against their land?
They gave an allowance,
therefore-
not against the land, against the sewer capacity.
I understand, but the sewer capacity was predicated on a value if we develop the whole thing on the north side. That's where the sewer capacity, 400,000 gallons. Yeah, you sure?
I think the capacity was based on this analysis.
Well, I have not
Which-
read it. I just handed that a moment ago.
That-
So pardon
that's
me for
fair.
Being a little bit on the backside. But
That's
my point,
fair.
I'm not being argumentative. I just want to
Mhm.
be clear of what
Okay.
I understand and I don't understand. So if the Vickeries then put up money or allowance against money, because their value of their land went from 2-acre lot went to, well, it did. Because now you got a sewer, you can add more lots, sell more lots, you got more value per dollar. So they got more value for their project. They invested in their own project to raise the value. Yes, it was going to help the south side and the north side as well. That was the program between the city and that, which is fine. So what I'm really saying is they took it all the way to the curb at at their curb. Now Toll Brothers, with the help of Vickery's, took it all the way to 407. Is that correct?
Toll Brothers paid for their development serving infrastructure. Vickery paid
Which
for
that is that property
oversizing.
over there on that side of the road.
Yes.
Okay, so in other words, Vickery's got some monies in the game through an allowance of their property. And Toll Brothers put in real money to finish out the project to get it up to 407. Is that correct?
I don't understand the narrative that you're trying to explain.
Well, I'm trying to explain the money that Vickery's are owed and have been paid. And now we're going to put interest on the money on the north side forever. And it'll just keep rolling until somebody develops or never develops. So we have no guarantee that the people on the north side, the Buttons primarily, they're here. I talk directly to them. If they decide never, they got a large piece of property. I guess that's one of the larger ones on that side of the street. So if they develop in this usage is going to be higher. I understand they're not going to be used for it, but everybody has to pay a portion of the gallons, not the how many hookups. It's the gallons you're using. So therefore, if there's not nearly that many gallons, then the ones on the tail end of this situation is going to pay more pro rata for that.
I disagree with that.
Okay,
So,
correct me, please.
yes, sir. Nobody pays anything if they don't use the capacity.
That's not what I said.
If they use the capacity, they only pay the allocable share of the capacity they use.
Well, let's say you got 400,000 gallons on tap, usable, and you wind up using, well, let's say 325,000. So you're 75,000 gallons more capacity that you have users. Well, the contract is for 400,000 gallons with Flower Mountain. So they're charging us 400,000 gallons, whether we use it or don't use it. So I'm saying the Vickery's then have the property on the north side wants to be developed to help offset that balance so that they can get their money back for their initial investment. And the gallonage then is dispersed. Maybe I'm a little bit wrong there. in my thinking.
So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to explain it to you the way I explain it to my clients.
All right.
And just by way of context, I'm a lawyer and all I do is represent owners and developers who are negotiating with or arm wrestling with government on matters like this. And this is what I tell the folks that are asked to pay oversized infrastructure, not just in Copper Canyon and not just the Vickery's, but universally. This is the deal. New development is required to pay for infrastructure necessary to serve new development. If you're going to oversize, you need to seek reimbursement for the oversizing to avoid an illegal exaction. But just because you have a reimbursement tool, which is what this reimbursement agreement is, just because you have a reimbursement tool doesn't mean you're going to be reimbursed, because your neighbor that's also going to develop has the same rights you do. So your neighbor, when they go to develop, is going to do a cost benefit analysis. They're going to say, as a legal matter, I'm responsible for the infrastructure required for my new development. Is it cheaper for me to build my own line, or is it cheaper for me to pay for a portion of the oversizing capacity? And they'll make the business decision based on those economics. Nobody's making them use the line that's there, but if they use the line, it's only fair that they pay their share. It's not fair to burden the first one in with all the costs.
No, ma'am, I understand that part
Okay.
very clearly, but that's really not my point.
Okay, then I don't understand.
Okay, no problem. The point is, when the valuation of the 400,000 gallons was estimated by the engineers to saying this would be, if everything was developed, we'll get 400,000 gallons. That's our capacity. Okay. Bings, as I understand it, there's one, I don't know if there's others that were not involved in the discussion of this when they were passed. So if the buttons were considered part of the land area for it to be considered, if we do all these things, whatever it is, to equal 400,000 gallons, that would be our capacity. And that's what the valuation pro rata is based on, the 400,000 gallons. It's what its original aggregate assessment is. Is that correct?
Yes, it's
Okay.
a capacity
So if that-
allocation.
If you have citizens out here that have property in that area who is not involved with the negotiation, or maybe everybody thought that everybody knew everything, but sometimes everybody don't know everything. And so I'm certainly one of those capacities.
Me too.
So therefore, I'm just a country guy. I just try to get it down to real simple terms. And I may be running a rabbit in the wrong hole. I don't know. But the point is, if the way I'm trying to, in my mind, assess this is, if certain people, they ought to be, if we're never going to get to 400,000, then their people are paying a value based on the gallons, yes, but it's assessed on the 400,000, that number. Well, that's the capacity that the assessment of the line is built for. So therefore, the line is that part. So I guess really, I understand assessment. I understand the tapping in. I understand if you don't have it, you can't develop it. I mean, I got all those things. I know this town has lived up to its obligation to date. We have not sheltered anything. We took the money, we put it in accounts, we moved it from here to there, give it back to the Vickery. They're the one that took the risk, if you please. That was an endeavor to help them. Don't kid yourself. You did it to help yourself first. You may be helping the town second, but you really were helping yourself first, which that's the way the American dream is. That's what we do. If I have a business, I want to start it, I either reap the benefit or I take the lick. Well, there's no licks to be taken at this point. All you're asking is to go ahead, but the value is based on the total aggregate, not just what, let's suppose 25% more and doesn't ever show up. So what happened to their money that they never collected aggregate on that?
So what if I said to you, Kathleen, don't make your head explode because I'm not offering this. I'm not making decisions for you. I'm asking a hypothetical question. Hypothetically, nobody else taps into that line. The person that paid 100% of the line is the Vickeries.
Mhm.
So if you don't want to extend the pro rata agreement, which is what the Vickeries are asking you to do, to give folks a chance to tap into the line. But if you don't want to extend it, you could just give 100% of the capacity to the Vickeries because they paid for it. Because why should
Who could give
anybody,
that back? Excuse me, who would give that back?
the town could give a reservation of capacity to the people that paid for the capacity. So if nobody wants to pay for it except the Vickeries, then only the Vickeries can use it.
I can't hear you. Yeah, right. I'm not.
And I'm not suggesting that's the right thing because that was never the spirit of the deal. I'm just saying it's not fair for the Vickeries to pay for everything and others to receive a windfall.
I agree. I just don't know how this.
Part of the problem is, that's why the deal was struck on capacity.
Yes.
It stops at the Vickery.
Okay.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
So what you're paying for is capacity, not the extension of the line.
And for,
That's why intellectually, it's kind of hard for you to grasp. There's nothing in the ground and I'm paying for something that's not in the ground. What you're paying for is access to the flower line system.
Yeah.
That's what the other. problem is.
And again,
And those are the numbers.
and correct, and the assumption was that the development was gonna happen much sooner than it has. I mean, the assumption back in 2013 was that we would be
Done
faced with
already.
no more development along 407. And that is a complication. I mean, we thought 10 years was an awfully long time to get that corridor developed.
If it's based off of percentage, which I get, and I'm totally for getting back anything you paid over and above what the town required, why wouldn't the number for certified costs include the whole line, start to finish? Because you got it engineered based off start to finish. So theoretically, that number should be what it would cost to complete the whole line, and then everybody has a percentage of that total cost. Either that, or you just pay for the cost to, or you only get back the oversized portion of it.
So I think the cost is based on the whole line.
Okay, that would
And-
be start to finish all the way through the people that are allocated, so the buttons, I guess.
So when I say the whole line, I mean what was constructed and accepted, not future improvements that are extensions of the line. So to me, the whole line is the piece of pipe that went in the ground starting in 2013 and completed in 2016. That whole line has a total cost. And that total cost is represented by a gallon capacity, and only an oversized portion of that gets reimbursed. Now, the Vickeries are asking for interest or carry cost on those dollars. And I believe that's a reasonable ask. And you may say, well, why? We did our part. They didn't do their part. They didn't develop. It's 10 years later. Why should they get interest? Well, the reason I believe I would like to see them get interest is because we all know that investments are intended to bear interest, have carrying costs. And if folks were putting that infrastructure in the ground now, the people in the future that are going to benefit from tapping into that line, we're putting it in the ground now, they would be paying more. And so we're not trying to be greedy. We're not trying to overreach. We're just trying to be treated fairly. And we also know you're the arbiters of fairness. We're going to do what you decide because you are the decision makers. And so we're looking to you to treat the Vickeries fairly.
Let me, if I could jump in here real quick, because I want to go back to the hypothetical that you just gave, because it brought up a question that I don't understand. We were talking about that in your hypothetical that nobody else develops or uses any capacity. Then the Vickeries have the total capacity. Let's ignore the Siciliano development for the time being in this hypothetical. Mr. Hager, you said that that capacity now belongs to the Vickeries, correct? All right. Who owns that line once it's built? And we're responsible for the maintenance, the upkeep, or anything else. But they own it? I don't understand how that works. They own the right. So exactly, which that does make sense. So my question is, why don't we take the town out of being the enforcement arm of this deal and allow a future developer, say the Buttons, they want to develop their property, they want to go 1/3 acre, which I believe is the zoning in that space, that part of their property. Why don't they negotiate with you or with the Vickeries, who now own all the capacity, and take us out of the deal? Because they're the ones who need to make investment decisions. They're the ones that are going to have to evaluate, is this worth it to me or not? They might decide, you know what, we couldn't come to an agreement, so we're going to upzone ourselves, go 2 acres and put in mansions on 2 acres, and we don't have to deal with it. So see, the point is, and my big problem with this whole situation is, the town, at one point, it was decided that they would come to this agreement. It's a different council, it's a different mayor, we're in a different time. There were 10 years allowed for this to occur, for the fairness that you were asking. We're approaching the end of that, and it's been pretty much a boom time for building, and nothing's happened, and now you're asking us to extend. And on top of that, from my perspective, as a a homeowner. If I was in the Button shoes or somebody else, now in a sense, by adding an interest, you're penalizing me because I haven't gotten around to sell my property, because every year that I don't develop, if I ever want to use that sewer, I got to pay more. So now it becomes a penalty, if you will. And so I find that if in fact the capacity goes back to them, rightly so, they paid for it, let them negotiate with future developers on what it's worth to them at the time and take the town out of it.
So I think the problem with taking the town out of it is Flower Mound won't let you. That's always been the problem.
Environmental deal with.
They'll have to deal with you, is what you're saying, is the agreement needs to be rebutted. The problem is you can't advocate your responsibility to operate sewer system.
That's the problem.
Right.
You can't turn a public system into a private system.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's no one up here who wants to be unfair to the Vickeries or anybody else in town. I
Agreed,
think
thank
that's a
you.
full stop statement. The complexity of this agreement is substantial. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I think it's aired a lot of issues that we've put on the table. I think we've already come to the conclusion that we have to audit the numbers of request 2. What might make best sense here is to have a committee or subcommittee of this group meet with you and have a more thoughtful discussion about some of these dynamics with Bob in the room to really go through what it means. What are the pros and cons to the town? How are we being fair, unfair to the Vickeries? How are we being fair, unfair to future development along? Nobody wants to be unfair to the Buttons or anybody else either.
Yes, sir.
So I think and again, some of this was a little bit, to be frank, rushed on some of the folks up here that didn't have a lot of the schedules, the numbers were new. So I think having that conversation in a sort of very sober way, and it may take several hours, I wouldn't be surprised. It's already been, 40 minutes here. Having that conversation would make sense. So my suggestion to the council is that we table it, establish a committee for that discussion. Do I have any volunteers up here who can be a part of that discussion? Chase, volunteer. One more. Dale.
I think we only have more than 2 councilmen.
2 is all we have. That's it.
We have 3, we just have to post it. That's all.
Oh, I think 2 is fine. I think the rest of us trust that Dale and Chase can get us to an agreement. So why don't we have a motion that is
All you need is
establishing
a
that.
And to appoint executive committee of town council for Dale and Chase.
Right.
May I provide one additional point of information that I think might be helpful to the committee if it's appointed?
Sure.
I think it would be helpful to recirculate the document, because I know Melissa drafted it and it's been a minute since it was drafted, but when I looked at it with fresh eyes, there were a couple of what I would call technical things, maybe Bob would say boilerplate type things, that I think need to be looked at. Like by way of example, I want to make sure the assignment provision is clear, that by way of example, the Vickeries could assign to an heir or a future owner of the property. I also think there's been some internal parties change, maybe the trust changed to individuals, and that's got to be cleaned up. We've got these new ethics forms, Form 1295. I think it's important that we reference those Form 1295 so everybody knows their ethical responsibility to fill out the form. So there's some hygiene or cleanup items that I would like to do to the agreement. So if you would indulge me, once the committee is appointed, if it is appointed, I would like to recirculate an agreement so that we're all talking about the most current agreement.
That makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
Steve, before we make a motion, I think the one other talking point, and I don't think we really addressed it, was the issue of interest, where you have an existing agreement, there is not interest. And I think that's one that the discussion has been good tonight and helpful, and it's been good that you're able to clarify a lot of this, but that's just a fundamental issue that I don't know how we get around that or over that, because I suspect there's not going to be an appetite for it. And I think, one of the points that Dale was building up to on this discussion, there was a conscious decision to put sewer capacity in. And I think we have to be careful that somehow that morphs into the town becoming an investor. And it's really murky, because the reality is, and we're taking a point in time, 2013, where decisions were made. The reality is you have, over a passage of time from 2005 to 2022, different economic cycles, and all interested parties live with whatever is going on at that time. But to Dale's point, there were deliberate decisions made from an investment standpoint that we need to be careful that the town is not getting into a position where, when you start paying interest, and Bob, this is one where we would have to look very carefully as to whether we can, and to me, the bigger point, whether we should.
It's kind of, I wasn't here in 2013, so I can't speak of what was discussed and what was talked about. But generally, those costs of carry do find their way in pro rata agreements, and I've seen ones that didn't. And now you're kind of renegotiating the deal. That's his part.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have opinions on that you want to share tonight. I think we should share those opinions, but I think we can have those as inputs to the discussion that we have in the committee. And I would suggest, Misty, that you come with a business case that says, here's why 5% is what we want, and here's why we think it's
Yes,
the town
sir.
should agree to.
Yes,
I
sir.
don't know what that.
I think that's fine. I didn't want to leave this topic tonight without, because I think this is going to be a bigger issue than one
I think
thinks.
that's a great point. Yeah.
Because that's a different deal.
Right.
Well, it changes the dynamic of the deal quite a bit. And I was very curious about it, but frankly, it's a moot point if we're not going to extend this and if we don't agree with the number.
Well, and also the point that was brought up by Mr. Siciliano,
That's right.
from my standpoint, if we're going to be fair, we need to be fair to everybody. And the buttons, I'm hopeful that we can have a channel of communication, because I didn't know, you were not aware of the history of this, but you're a very significant landowner, and, as has been discussed, you may choose to do 2-acre estate lots, in which case we need to be respectful of that.
That's right.
Agreed.
So other discussion? Great points, Larry.
Well, overall, a very productive discussion. Thank you. for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Thank you. We
I have a
appreciate the
motion?
dialogue.
I'll make a motion that we table this topic until we can convene an executive committee to further discuss and explore the topic that we've discussed.
And the committee will be comprised of
Councilman Andrews, Councilman Libbert, and perhaps our attorney.
Yes. Thank you.
yes. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second by Mr. Johnson. All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Steve, you or
Very well. Action 2 was to discuss, consider, and take action regarding a joint interlocal cooperation agreement with law enforcement. We have postponed the sheriff's contract discussion to the next meeting of September 12th. So we can skip this one. Action 3, discuss, consider, take action regarding the ordinance 22-009, amending chapter 13, utilities by adding article 13.06, cable and video franchise to the existing ordinance. This is a franchise with Spectrum for cable and video services in the Vickery subdivision.
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem and Town Council members, this item was originally in your packet. I'll take the blame for this. I misunderstood what Donna wanted, but generally at this point, what we've done with the new ordinance that you have in front of you is we've pared it down significantly. And what we're doing is delegating to the town administrator the responsibility to give permission to enter the right of way and to charge the statutory fee. Traditionally, cities and towns have the responsibility for governance of their right of way. And as part of that, people that have gas companies like Atmos and New Mexican Power wanted to put infrastructure, public utilities in the municipal right of way. In order to do that, the municipality had to grant a franchise. And so that was done by ordinance, and we got to negotiate and establish what the fee would be for the maintenance of those utilities in the city maintained right of way. About 12 years ago, the legislature in their infinite wisdom took really that responsibility away from cities and towns and said that we could only charge a set fee and that we had to allow them, if there was capacity in that right of way, to allow them to put fiber optics, telecommunications. And it was basically the fiber network that we all enjoy, either through cable or through the internet. We're capped at 5%. Instead of going through this theater of going through a franchise agreement, I propose to put this ordinance in place that allows those safeguards that are required, the indemnity agreement, all the things that go along with that right, and do it by ordinance and delegating that responsibility to the town administrator and to our, in essence, our town engineer. When those plans come forward for that franchise, they would go to the engineer to determine whether or not fiber optic can be put in the right of way without disturbing the water line, the gas line, the electrical lines, or any other utilities that lie within the right of way. And since the legislature has really taken our ability to govern ourselves on this issue, it just made sense that this is a more ministerial act than it is a legislative act like it used to be years ago. So I'm just proposing this ordinance to allow any utility, in this case Spectrum, to get the required permit from the town administrator to put the line in. They, in this case, our town engineer has approved the placement of those lines, and all we can charge is the statutory 5% now, which is what the ordinance allows. So it becomes a more ministerial and routine matter instead of a legislative matter that it has been in the years past. So I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Any questions for Bob? Relatively straightforward. Thanks for the amendment to the deduct. Everybody got the copy of the final, right?
Yes, the only comment I want to quickly make, and it all sounds great to me. I mean, if it's something simple and it's more of a normal management issue that the town can handle without jumping through hoops, I'm all for it. The only issue that I want to mention for myself is we just got this when this evening, and I haven't had a chance to read it. And I really would like to read it before I vote on it, unlike Congress sometimes when they vote on stuff before they read it. So I would ask that, given, maybe till next meeting or something, to be able to, just so that I know what I'm voting on.
There's no damage in doing that. There's no issue between now and the next meeting.
So based on that, I would like to make a motion that we table this until the next meeting so that we have plenty of opportunity to read and understand what it is that we're voting on.
Do I have a second? Second. Mr. Councilmember Andrews, seconds. All in favor of tabling it for next meeting?
Aye.
Unanimous. Okay, action 4, discuss, consider, take action regarding an ordinance regulating short-term rentals. Bob, you want to give some perspective on this?
Yes, it has come to our attention that we've had a number of properties that have operated in town in short-term rentals as rental facilities for parties and special events. This is a problem that's not only faced by the town, but it's faced by almost every city in Texas now with the short-term rentals or Airbnb or Vrbo or other booking agencies. We had some issues that staff brought to me. I only proposed this ordinance because it's one way to legislatively handle the problem with Airbnb. Here's the argument for, obviously, if you're a Texas property rights person, you got to be able to do with whatever you want on your property. That's true, except for under state law and under case law, you're entitled to do whatever you want on your property as long as a reasonable exercise of the police power is being utilized, for example, zoning. So the argument for regulation is when I bought my house or I bought my acreage here in town, I expected it to be residential. I didn't expect it to be turned into a party venue or a special events venue or a hotel. These regulations may be more than what you want to do. I understand that given the more rural setting and the separation between properties, but this is a jumping off point for you to begin discussions. Another way of handling this, of course, is through zoning. There has been some case law upholding zoning regulations that have allowed cities to say that a special events venue is not a residential use and should not be allowed in a residential district. More recent case is a case involving the city of Arlington, where they kind of have a prohibition of STRs, except for within 1 mile of Jerry Jones's football stadium, Texas Rangers facility, Six Flags and Hurricane Harbor, and their vacation venues. So this is merely a jumping off point for you to have a discussion. I didn't really think that we would pass this ordinance tonight, but I need to know from you what you think's fair and what you think's not fair, or how much to regulate, or how little to regulate, or do we need to address this through zoning? If we do, then I need to have a discussion with the planning and zoning and staff to approach it that way. I think zoning is the more easier way to try to regulate this in the beginning, instead of, you don't have a large staff, so then you're asking Donna and the town secretary to try to administer a program which is more like a rental registration program. And maybe zoning is a better way of handling it.
Part of the complication with zoning is there's no center of interest to create a concentric ring around to zone differently.
I understand that too. I've been here for long enough to know that.
I was under the impression that the legislature is going to be taking action because you get a diversity of opinion and ordinances. Is there any update on that? Or?
It's been introduced twice in the last 2 legislative sessions. Neither time did it make the floor to be voted on. There's some case law out there now, which the legislature may wish to address. I think that zoning is a better way of handling this issue than regulate. If you regulate it, you have to permit it. If you zone it, then what I would recommend is you do it by special use permit. There may be circumstances where this kind of use is appropriate in your town. I've had this discussion with our good folks in Argyle before. Hate to mention that, but I have. And they struggled with it as well. And they had a rodeo venues where people, pay to come, pay to participate. And that was acceptable because it was a use that some of the members of the community felt was compatible with the lifestyle that's developed here. People have horses and cattle, and it's more rural setting, and it was appropriate.
But was that a static or was it a termed permission?
It was static because it was a use that they wanted to allow.
Okay.
So I appreciate that you put the draft in there. I think one of the takeaways from our July workshop was we thought that this topic had to be addressed, but we wanted to get public input on this. And maybe I think the draft sets the
Help start that.
yeah, should start that process, because I know that there are strong feelings among our citizens, some in favor, some opposed. And that this is a tricky issue.
Yeah, it's a very tricky issue because a lot of the complaints that people have, I call Miss Trousseau's piano lessons. Everyone loves Miss Trousseau and loves her piano lessons, but some of the same issues under traditional home occupations. And this is another business use. I mean, people refer to this as a business, not as their home that they're renting a room to for the night. And so, there's those issues that I know that recently Airbnb has adopted a very strong stance about any of their properties being used for a party or special event venue. They will no longer take those listings. They announced that, I think it was last week.
That's right.
And then there's this issue about home occupation that we struggle with a lot in zoning. I'm not saying that we here in town struggle with it, all cities struggle with what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for someone to run a business out of their house. It's one thing for, a sleazy old lawyer like me to take and make phone calls and do Zoom meetings. It's another thing for me to have, 100 people show up to buy goods and operate a retail store, because now you've got traffic and people in and out. My neighbors didn't buy their home for me to run a business, like a retail business out of the house. So there's a balance. We always try to strike that balance when we define it. And I've talked to Mark about home occupations and Donna about that. And that's one of the struggles. If someone has a special events venue, that to me is not home occupation. Home occupation shouldn't load anything to your neighbors or to the street system, to police presence, and all those things. If you're having a party and charging people to either participate or show up to a wedding or some other special event. So
Steve, I would suggest with this document as a starting point, sooner rather than later, that we canvass and get public input on this.
Yeah. That's pretty obvious. And thank you, Bob, for putting it together, because I do think there is a lot in here that, again, we can vet with people to get temperature on. There's a general concept of, do we regulate or do we not regulate this, or do we put it into a zoning context or do we not? And then if you do, what are the specifics? What are the details? Because they're going to matter.
And I've continued, I even went to a national seminar on this issue. You can believe that. It's such a big topic, that in Florida, people have rented their homes for years in Florida, or have a second home, and then they only stay there in January, and the other 11 months out of the year, they rent it to other people. California near the beach, or where there's what I would call a vacation spot or resort spot, have dealt with this problem for years. And now it's come to places like Capel and Flower Mound, and some citizens complain about it more than others in certain cities. Some don't even know that the house next door may be Airbnb at all. Others have had the LSU football team show up. I've had that, so you can imagine what kind of fun that was.
Well, frankly, I think in the spirit of this conversation, people in this town would just assume be members of the first group, which were they don't know that their house is being used for Airbnb. And again, we like to think that people in the town have good intentions and are respectful of their neighbors, and they wouldn't create a scenario where an entire football team was showing up. But again, we also know, being pragmatists, that not everybody acts in good faith, and there are oftentimes when, right? That's unfortunately true sometimes, that you have to sometimes move only as slow as the slowest marcher, or regulate at the level of permissibility. So I don't think anybody up here wants more regulation, just as a general rule. So next step is we'll table it for this meeting. I think we got to put together some sort of plan to vet this with.
On the website and
Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say. We need to have a process by which we vet this document, the latest one, with everybody in town to take a look at and provide feedback for and or against. And then we can have a more educated, and Donna, if you would sort of collect input, and if you get 100 responses, let's figure out, how many are in what direction, and try to get some sense of that.
And if they put it out there, things you like and things you don't like would be helpful as we either expand or narrow this. And so,
Yeah. So would someone like
because
to
I
make a
gave
motion
you,
accordingly?
I gave you a high-end regulatory ordinance.
High end meaning quality, or high end meaning high level?
Lots of regulation, lots of staff time.
Yeah. So we got our money's worth on this. Yeah, thank you. Larry?
Before I make a motion, could I make some quick comments?
Yes, sir.
I have found this draft and this, because I know we talked about it at the workshop. This is extremely complex. And my initial gut reaction as a property rights person, like you mentioned, I love property rights. I think if you own the land, you should be able to do almost anything as long as it's legal. But then when I started thinking about, all right, let me put myself in the shoes of my neighbor, rents out his place. And he thinks he rented it to a nice couple, and 50 college kids show up, and they're up at 4 a.m, hooting and hollering and making a fuss. Now I have to complain to the staff, who now has to deal with this issue. So we're using our staff, who's, pretty busy all the time, may have to call law enforcement. And we all know that we have issues with the law enforcement. There's a lot of things here that, yes, we would all like to have control over something like this. And we all at the same time value our rights. And the fact that we all primarily moved here for a nice, peaceful, enjoyable life on our properties. That's why most of us are here. And so we don't want to have to deal with these issues. And no matter what anybody tells me, you can't control everybody that comes and goes. There's no way for you to properly vet everybody that you rent to. And from my perspective, once you start renting out your home and you do it constantly, it is no longer an issue of it being your home. You've now entered into a business to make money on your property. And that's certainly your right, but now we have to worry about the rights of the neighbors. And I think that we owe it to the town to ensure that and I really wish the entire town would opine on how they feel about it, because today you're the one who wants to rent it, and tomorrow you're the person who's the victim of somebody that improperly rented, or they rented to some undesirables or Lord knows what. So I think we need to truly discuss this, try to minimize the invasiveness of any document we come up with, because if it's too broad or too specific, now we're doing inspections, we're getting EMS chief to run around. I'm sure he doesn't want to go inspecting homes. It can get very complicated. So this is going to take some time to properly do this in a manner that's fair to everybody involved. Once again, we're back to the fairness issue. So if everybody's amicable, I would like to make a motion that we table this until we have an opportunity to present it to the town, and perhaps also to explain to them some of the potential limitations on things we can and can't do. And do what we can to get maximum input from the folks that own property in our town, because they're the ones who we're going to be talking to when they have a complaint because of something we did. The other thing to consider is, once we come up with an ordinance, in a sense, it seems to me that we are okaying this type of operation, which may put us in a legal liability issue. And I suspect that's where the issue of inspections and maps and all these things came about. Because in a sense, if we're giving somebody a permit to do this, then somehow somebody could say, well, you allowed this to happen in your town and you permitted it. I don't know if legally how deep that gets, but
I think that it's more perception that if you allow it and you give a permit for it and you don't regulate it, that you do condone it. I don't know the
Exactly.
legal liability. It's more optics than it is legal liability. I would be remiss not to say that I think the legislature will address this again. They will introduce some legislation. One of the things that I think that I want you to think about is owner occupied versus someone else buying a house and turning it into a business. And that's why the owner occupied provision is in there. It's different when it's my home. It's different if it's just a place that I own. And that's why owner occupied is there. So that, and I think it will be addressed because the realtors of Texas are very much in favor of this use. They even use some rental units are made out of houses that are being offered for sale. And so their lobby, I know, is in fact proposing legislation to prohibit the cities from regulating this. And I think that would be a huge disservice. So while there's legislature is going to address it, they may grandfather something that's already on the books. And so that's why I thought it's something that needed some attention.
Well, the other thing to
from
make
y'all.
sure that we make clear in this discussion is whatever we decide that we're going to regulate, we have to be able to effectively enforce. And it's not something that is, obvious, like grass being 10 feet tall in somebody's front yard. It can happen, it usually happens late at night or whenever there's, an egregious condition that's probably pretty personal to the neighbors on either side. And then they're going to have the police get involved, et cetera, et cetera. So that needs to be.
Yeah, and great points. And it sounds like we're potentially about to put a lot of energy and time into this subject, which could be tricky. So it would be nice to know what we've currently had as far as complaints, not necessarily a single residence, but different residences. And are we just putting this much emphasis because there's a lot of hype out in the public and other cities in the state? Or is there something that's imminent in our town that we have to address right now and create a whole ordinance for? So.
We received numerous complaints from residents. Whether there's a party or a wedding or something at traffic, a lot of complaints. And the residents have asked us to address that.
to your comment about the owner occupied, I think that certainly is something that we need to address. And the reason, because I spent a lot of time thinking about how to tackle this problem, assuming we were going to vote on it. But there's a difference when my neighbor lives there and there's a problem. I can text and call them and go, hey, John, really? It's 3 a.m. Come on, dude. Well, most neighbors recognize that although they may not like having to react to that, they know they're going to live next to me for a long time. So it's probably a good idea to find some amicable solution to the problem that night or whatever it is. Whereas somebody that, say, buys a house, starts renting it out constantly as purely a business, and they're calling it a B&B and they're renting it, 5 days at a time. Now there's, who am I going to call? Do I have to always call law enforcement, or do I always have to come to Donna and complain and say, hey, I've got a noise complaint? Who's going to enforce that? There's a lot of problems with this. We're a small town. We have limited budget. We have limited staff. So we got to think this through. And I think we just need to figure out how we're going to do this.
Somebody spiked my water with the diuretic. Anyway, so do I have a motion to?
This table, and we're gonna put it on with instructions.
Yes,
on the
exactly.
website.
Yeah. So basically, really, you already.
Yeah, I'll make a motion that we table this subject for the time being and begin addressing the issue by getting as much resident input of our fellow neighbors, citizens, get them all involved, get their opinions on how they feel about the topic, because we're going to get a broad spectrum. But let's start with them, since they too will be impacted by this. And I think that the more people we get involved in this, the better off we'll be.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous, tabled. With instructions. Action 5, discuss, consider, and take action regarding ordinance 22-010, amending chapter 4, business regulations, article 4.05 of oil and gas drilling and production. The language is in your packets. This looks to me to be administrative in many ways, right? Sort of cleaning up.
This is really Donna's baby, as she went through and reviewed the oil and gas ordinance, made the recommendations that you have before you, and she can address the substance of those recommendations. But they're very perfunctory.
That's what I thought, Donna.
Ron Weatherby and I. Ron Weatherby and I went through this ordinance 2 or 3 times. We compared it with other ordinances. A lot of the terminology in the oil and gas ordinance is old. We went through and updated the ordinance. We looked at the things that we could not enforce that are in there now, like the electric motors. I believe Mr. Weatherby said he's been doing this for 35 years. There's really only one electric motor in the area, and I think it's in Flower Mound. And so we changed the ordinance to address that. And that's basically all we did. Just updated and changed the electric motor portion.
Mm-hmm. And hours of operation
Yes.
correction.
That was one thing, it was from 7 to 7. Yeah, and we changed.
It was
that.
7 to 9. We
7
changed
to 9, we changed it.
7 to 7. Yeah. Any questions or comments?
Are you requiring electric? Is that what you changed?
Yeah.
Okay, what exactly was changed regarding electric?
In the old ordinance, and this is probably over 10 years old, we required electric motors, and you don't hardly find those at all. And so we changed that.
Oh, yes.
Because if we, I talked with Bob, if we chose to take that to court, town would lose.
Well, as long as they meet sound requirements.
Yeah. as
Right,
long as
they
meet
can
the sound
encapsulate-
requirement. Because
Right. Right.
and the Railroad Commission, in their benevolence, has determined that that's an operational issue and we cannot regulate operational issues. The equipment used to extract the gas is part of their function as a Railroad Commission. I can do sound, I can do noise, but those are sound and noise regulations, not the kind of equipment. That's the Railroad Commission's. That's why I asked her to look at that issue with Ron.
Hey, Steve, you might mention also changing distance, property line versus facade.
Yes, let me get that.
Yeah, that was changed for the measurement.
Yeah, the well to the property line, and now it's to the facade of the house.
Got it. Thank you. Good clarification. So it cleans up a lot of the stuff we actually talked about in the workshop. Any other questions, comments? Do I have a motion?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, please.
I did have from my point of view, since it was just brought up about that change of the noise measurement from the property line to the, I guess, closest part of the house, exterior wall, et cetera. I would rather keep the property line because my objective is to protect the homeowners from noise that they may or may not have agreed to have. So that's a change that I think if we're trying to do what's best for everybody involved, those kind of noise levels continuously could be a problem. So I would rather leave it as the property line, only because it goes to benefit homeowners more than the gas operation. The other question I had had to do with the noise levels. 78 decibels is very loud for those of you that aren't familiar with the decibel measurement system. And allowing that from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. is, even though it's during the day, if you are in your home, either you're retired or you work from home, things like that, I consider that pretty loud. My question is, do we have the ability to regulate that noise level? For example, in a better scenario, to make it 56 decibels 24/7. Do we have that ability?
I don't believe you can do that because you can get that with just ambient noise during the day, cars going by. You can't maintain it 52 decibels with just cars, trucks going by, construction noise.
Yeah, but this specifically addresses the well itself making that much noise. And yes, I understand because I've gone out there to stand on Copper Canyon Road and listen to how loud the well is, et cetera. And yes, you're correct, during the day, the road noise is louder than that well because I've stood out there and I've listened. But that would be an issue of how to measure the well versus allowing it to get up to 78 decibels. And so I didn't know if there was a Railroad Commission statute or a state statute that prevented us from requiring an even lower decibel level. I was waiting.
Probably it's unreasonable for you to lower the level at below the ambient noise where the well is located.
I can understand that. Okay.
If you go below the ambient noise,
You're not going to hear it. You're going to hear the ambient noise, correct?
and if the oil and gas people said, I cannot get the oil or the gas out of that well and operate that equipment at that decibel level, so you deny me my right to extract the minerals. And I would suggest to you, in the state of Texas, we are never going to win that.
I understand that.
So then it's not reasonable, and therefore if it's unreasonable, it's
The last question I have for you is, if we were to pass this, what happens to the wells that are currently in place and that were instituted under the previous ordinance? They have to come into compliance. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'd agree with Rudy about the Beers property line. Doesn't make sense if we're trying to help a homeowner with noise. Why would you move it from the property line to the house? Unless it's a house that's actually on the same property as the well. Yeah, I agree. I don't see we're benefiting somebody else there. Leave that to where it was.
Which we have in the Hartley's case.
Yeah.
one's a caution or safety zone, another's not.
So would it make sense to approve with the modification of changing property line to, or facade
Property line.
to property line, except in conditions or situations where it's on the same property. If it's within the property line, then
That makes so much sense.
you've got a, math problem because you're going the wrong way.
We will make that change if you make a motion to approve, we'll understand that includes that change.
Right, that's what I'm asking for the motion to include that change.
I have a question, please.
Yes, sir.
Donna, as it stands today, and with everything we know as now, is the city within its bounds of compliance with that well as far as is legally binding from our ordinance and the state's ordinance? Are we bound to be in that balance of compliance?
We are in compliance. They are.
So therefore, if we go ahead and put in the 78, that's still the state bound allowance. So we're just duplicating what is state mandates, not what we try to dictate. So we can't make the 56 stick. Anyway, if we did do that in court of law, we probably couldn't make that hold up. I mean, I'm just speculating.
It's 78, 56, okay, those noise levels, I'm telling you, the operator of the well is gonna probably tell you that they cannot get the noise level down below 56 and extract their, and therefore it is unreasonable.
That's my point. So why should we try to address it if it's not addressable?
When we have addressed it to 78,
That's
it's
what I'm saying.
probably acceptable during the day.
I understand.
So we're gonna hold them that standard, so it's not twice that long.
But I just wanted the folks in the audience and the city to understand that we are in compliance as it stands now. I understand the situation, but I still understand compliance. And that's what we got to go by is the rules. We can't make up rules as we go. I mean, sometimes in the past, no, we don't.
I understand what you're saying, that we adopt these standards, that we can make them, that the railroad commission and or a well operator will not be able to challenge them. It's not-
That's right.
Okay.
That makes sense. I don't know.
Other comments, questions? Do we have a motion with the edit on changing the closest facade to property line? Acceptance of the same property.
Motion to approve subject to the modification of the language proposed by Councilmember Libbert and clarified by Mr. Hager, our town attorney. So we have a motion.
I have a motion by Mr. Johnson. Do I have a second? Mr. Andrews, all in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. That's it. Item 6, discuss, consider, take action regarding scheduling of the September 12th, 2022 public hearing on the proposed fiscal year budget 2022 to 2023 and the adopting of said budget. Everybody should note that our budget is on file here at Town Hall for anybody to take a look at. And it's available right now, correct, Donna?
It's holding the tax rate.
Yeah,
It's the same.
no change, no increase in tax. Do I have a motion? Just to schedule
Yeah, I'll make a motion that we schedule for 9/12/2022 as a date for a public hearing on the proposed fiscal year 22 to 23 budget.
Councilmember Castillo made a motion to schedule the 9/12/22 as the date for the public hearing on the proposed FY 22-23 budget and to schedule the 9/12/22 date as the date for adopting the proposed budget. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second by Councilmember Johnson. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. 7, and this is going to be a roll call vote, which is associated with the prior. Discuss and consider adopting the the submission of the no new revenue and voter approved tax rate calculations, take action to consider the proposed tax rate, which is the same, and schedule a September 12th, 2022 for public meeting to consider the proposed tax rate.
Mayor Pro Tem, just for the public, this is not a vote on the tax rate. This just establishes the maximum rate and the no new revenue rate and the voter approval tax rate
Correct.
for the public. So all you're doing is again, just establishing the hearing date and
Right.
the adoption.
Do I have a motion?
All right, I'll make a motion that we accept the submission of the no new revenue and voter tax rate calculations and schedule September 12th, 2022 as the date for the public meeting in which the proposed tax rate will be considered.
That's clear. Thank you, Councilman Castillo. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second by Councilmember Johnson. Roll call vote. Councilmember Liver. How do you vote?
Aye.
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 Unanimous. Oh, I have to vote too? Okay, aye. Just checking. Thank you. Appreciate that. Then we're very unanimous. Very good. Any future items for future meetings? Anybody? Time is almost just after 5:09. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Make a motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
I'll second. I
All in
second.
favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you, guys.